Ukraine is feeling the strain like never before on its resources to defend itself from Russia. Donald Trump has made it all too clear that Ukraine can no longer rely on the immediate support of massive military and financial support in its fight for freedom. But is there an alternative source of vitally needed aid and support for Ukraine? Well, there is a stockpile worth hundreds of billions of pounds that at the moment is sitting idle. Since the start of the war in Ukraine in early 2022, governments in the West have frozen and therefore effectively seized billions of pounds worth of Russian assets, often lying in Western banks. But what are they made up of, and why, 3 years later, are they still sitting frozen and not being used? Well, let's start with the scale of the situation. The Russian central bank says that over £200 billion worth of their assets are currently frozen in the West. Of that, roughly £25 billion are frozen here in the UK. This typically takes the form of assets owned by the Russian central bank here in the West, such as gold, foreign currency, and government bonds. The freezing of these assets held in the UK made it initially harder for Russia to fund its war in Ukraine because Moscow couldn't get its hands on these assets to fund its invasion of Ukraine. Now, separately, the UK government has been targeting so-called oligarchs, those incredibly rich people whose business empires, wealth and connections are closely associated with the Kremlin. The government says that at present, just over 1,700 of these often high-profile people are sanctioned, making it harder for them to use their funds to support President Putin. This has included people like the former Chelsea Football Club owner, Roman Abramovich, and the oligarch Oleg Sechin, who was described as Putin's right-hand man. Both men also own big stakes in Russian commodity companies. Sanctions have made it harder for them, and hundreds like them, to support an expensive lifestyle in the West, with things like access to their bank accounts made much harder. In fact, the £2.5 billion Abramovich made from the sale of Chelsea Football Club is still sitting idle, with the government threatening to sue him to make sure the proceeds of the sale will go to Ukrainian humanitarian aid. Frozen assets also extend to things like yachts, private jets, and even art collections, which the British government has tried to strip from the Russian oligarchs, but has in many cases failed to do so. With billions of pounds worth of frozen assets like these, there is growing pressure to use these frozen assets to help Ukraine against Russia, something that Ukrainians say would be transformative for their war effort against Russia.
With this money, we can buy weapons, and we can stop Russian aggression, and we can rebuild country, and so on and so on. And for the moment, we don't have this money, and Russia starts to speak about that they want this money to be given them back. Instead of seize this money, we're just leaving it on the table as a possible option for negotiation. I think that's absolutely a huge mistake.
So how do these assets compare in value to what Ukraine has received in direct aid already? Well, when you look at the over £200 billion worth of Russian assets frozen in the West since 2022, that sum is even more than the combined military aid that both Europe and the United States have given to Ukraine. Now, the West is already able to give Ukraine money on the interest generated from those frozen assets. Last year, the G7 group of wealthy nations, which does include the UK, agreed to give a loan of about £40 billion to Ukraine, which will gradually be paid off through that interest. But really, taking control of the assets themselves and giving them to Ukraine is not that simple. It can be a complicated process. When trying to take things like yachts or private planes from oligarchs, authorities have to prove a criminal case against each person that these assets belong to, which can be very hard to do. Russia can also retaliate, for example, by going after the cash of Western private investors in Russia. There's also a risk to a government's reputation that can come from seizing another government's assets. After all, how will other countries feel that their assets held in London or New York would be secure from such measures in the future? They may take Russia's example and decide to hold their foreign assets outside the West.
There's also a question, particularly for the European Union, around trust in the euro. If you invest and hold your central bank reserves in Europe and they get confiscated by the European Union, are you going to do that again? Is it going to set a precedent where, having confiscated Russia's assets, other countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE or China might say, well, we're not going to invest in European assets anymore?
With signs that Europe may no longer be able to rely on the US to chip in for Ukraine's defense, solutions like the use of Russian assets to help Ukraine are back on the table. But the seizure of assets can be far from straightforward, which takes time, and that is something Ukraine does not have much of.